July 17th, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter watched through his Panzer Mark IV's periscope as another American Sherman tank erupted into flames. The explosion came not from his 75mm round, but from something far more devastating. The Sherman's own ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that turned the 33-ton vehicle into a steel crematorium in less than 8 seconds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He'd seen it happen 17 times in the past 6 days. The Americans called them Shermans. His crew had a different name, Ronsons, named after the American cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised lights, first time, every time. The nickname wasn't respect, it was contempt, wrapped in dark humor. The kind soldiers use when they've stopped seeing the enemy as human and started seeing them as statistics. But something was about to change, something Richter and every German tanker in France hadn't anticipated. The Americans were learning, and in war, adaptation is survival. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The Sherman tank entered service in 1942 with a fatal flaw that would haunt American armored divisions for 2 years: its ammunition storage system. 75mm shells sat in racks along the sponsons, those curved sections on either side of the hull just above the tracks. The shells were stored vertically, tips pointing down, positioned exactly where German anti-tank rounds would penetrate after punching through the Sherman's relatively thin side armor. When a German shell hit, it didn't just pierce steel. It ignited propellant, and once one shell ignited, the rest followed in a catastrophic cascade. Tankers called it brewing up. The technical term was ammunition fire. But no clinical language could capture what it meant to be trapped inside a burning Sherman with temperatures reaching 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In seconds, hot enough to melt aluminum, to vaporize human tissue, to turn escape hatches into theoretical concepts rather than actual routes to survival. The statistics were brutal. In 1943, 60 to 80% of Shermans hit by German anti-tank fire suffered ammunition fires. Crew survival rates in those incidents dropped below 15%. The US Army knew they had a problem. What they didn't know yet was how to fix it without completely redesigning the tank. And redesigning meant stopping production. Stopping production meant fewer tanks reaching the front. Fewer tanks meant more dead infantrymen who needed armor support. The arithmetic of war sometimes forces impossible choices. Richter had been a tanker since 1941. He'd fought in North Africa, survived the retreat from Tunisia, retrained in France, and shipped to Normandy 2 weeks before D-Day. His Panzer Mark IV mounted a 75mm K 40 gun with significantly better penetration than the Sherman's main weapon. At 500 meters, his armor-piercing round could punch through 89mm of steel. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 51mm. The math was simple, lethal. But the Panzer's real advantage wasn't its gun. It was German doctrine. Years of mechanized warfare had taught Wehrmacht tankers to aim for specific weak points, track junctions to immobilize, vision ports to blind, and, most devastatingly, the sponson storage areas where American designers had foolishly placed the Sherman's ammunition. One hit there, and the crew had seconds to bail out. Most didn't make it. Richter's gunner, a 22-year-old farm boy from Bavaria named Werner, had perfected the shot. He aimed 2 feet below the turret ring, right where the hull began to curve. The round would penetrate, fragment, and ignite ammunition in a single fluid motion of physics and fire. Werner kept a tally scratched into the breech mechanism. 17 marks, 17 Shermans, 17 crews. He never talked about the men inside. None of them did. That was the unspoken rule of armored warfare. You destroyed machines, not people. The people just happened to be inside the machines. The hedgerows of Normandy turned tank combat into knife fights in a closet. Visibility dropped to 30 meters. Maneuver space disappeared. Shermans would round a corner and find themselves hull down with a panzer at point-blank range. The first shot usually decided everything, and in July of 1944, the Germans were winning those encounters at a rate of nearly 4-1. American tankers knew they were outgunned. They knew their armor was thinner. But worse than the technical disadvantages was the psychological weight of knowing that a single penetrating hit would likely kill them all. Not from the impact itself, but from their own ammunition, turning the tank into a funeral pyre they couldn't escape. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan commanded a Sherman in the 2nd Armored Division. He'd lost 2 tanks in 3 weeks, both times to ammunition fires. Both times he'd been one of the lucky ones who got out. His first loader hadn't been so fortunate. The kid's name was Patterson, 20 years old, from Oregon. He'd been reaching for another shell when the Panzer round came through the sponson. Donovan never saw what happened to him. He just heard the screaming stop very suddenly when the ammunition cooked off. The second time, Donovan's driver broke both legs scrambling through the floor escape hatch. The man survived, but would never walk right again. Donovan himself carried burn scars on his left arm from touching superheated metal on his way out. He didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? You climbed into a Sherman, knowing the odds. You did your job, and if you survived, you climbed into another Sherman and did it again. But something was changing back in the United States, something the German tankers couldn't see from their positions in the hedgerows. The American industrial machine, that vast network of factories and foundries and engineering departments, was responding to the crisis with the same methodical efficiency it applied to everything else. The problem had reached the desk of the Ordnance Department in April of 1944. Reports from North Africa, from Sicily, from Italy, all told the same story. Shermans were burning at catastrophic rates. Crews were dying not from superior German tactics, but from a design flaw that could theoretically be corrected. The question was how. Engineers at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Detroit proposed a radical solution. Instead of storing ammunition in the sponsons where it was vulnerable to side hits, move it to the hull floor, surround it with water-filled jackets that would absorb fragments and suppress fires. The system became known as wet stowage, and it would fundamentally change the Sherman's survivability in ways the Germans wouldn't understand until it was too late. The modification wasn't simple. It required redesigning the hull interior. Relocating ammunition racks meant relocating other equipment. The water jackets added weight, which affected the tank's power-to-weight ratio. Testing had to be done. Prototypes had to be built. Production lines had to be retooled. Every change rippled through the entire manufacturing process. But by June of 1944, the first wet stowage, Shermans began rolling off assembly lines. They looked identical to earlier models from the outside. Same 75mm gun, same sloped frontal armor, same track configuration. But inside, everything had changed. The ammunition sat low in the hull, surrounded by armored containers filled with water and ethylene glycol. A penetrating hit would rupture the jacket, releasing liquid that would flood the shell compartment and suppress ignition. The theory was sound. Whether it would work in combat remained to be seen. The first wet stowage, Shermans, reached Normandy in late July 1944. They arrived without fanfare, mixed in with standard production models. Crews didn't know they were different until they inspected the interior and found the new storage configuration. Some were skeptical. Water jackets seemed like wishful thinking against an 88mm round traveling at 2,000 feet per second. But the veterans, the ones who'd crawled out of burning tanks while their friends died inside, looked at those water-filled containers and felt something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence, just the smallest possibility that maybe this time they'd have a chance to bail out before the ammunition cooked off. Donovan's crew received a wet stowage Sherman on July 28th. His new loader, a replacement named Torres from New Mexico, asked what the metal containers were for. Donovan explained the concept while they loaded ammunition into the floor racks. Torres looked dubious. "So, we're carrying water to put out fires that haven't happened yet?" Something like that," Donovan said. "Seems like extra weight for nothing." "Yeah," Donovan agreed, "until it isn't." 3 days later, they found out, August 1st, 1944, a narrow road east of St. Lo. Richter's Panzer sat in a concealed position behind a collapsed barn. His orders were simple: wait for American armor to advance along the road, engage from ambush, withdraw before they could coordinate a response. It was the same tactic that had worked dozens of times before. Werner spotted the Shermans first, 4 of them, moving in column formation. Turrets traversed to cover different sectors. They were being cautious, that was new. Earlier in the campaign, American tanks had advanced with almost reckless confidence, trusting in their numerical superiority. Now, they moved like they'd learned to respect what was hiding in the hedgerows. "Range 400 meters, Werner reported. Lead tank is in the open." Richter studied the Sherman through his periscope. It looked like every other one they destroyed. Same profile, same vulnerable sponsons, same inevitable result. "Fire when ready," he ordered. The 75mm gun cracked. The armor-piercing round streaked across the 400 meters in less than a second. Richter watched through the periscope, already anticipating the familiar sequence: penetration, ignition, explosion. The round hit the Sherman's right sponson, exactly where Werner always aimed. The impact sparked against the armor. Metal shrieked, but what happened next froze every man in Richter's crew. The Sherman didn't explode. There was no secondary detonation, no ammunition fire, no catastrophic kill. The tank shuddered from the impact, slewed slightly to the left, and kept moving. Smoke poured from the penetration hole, but it was white smoke, steam, not the black, oily smoke of burning propellant. "Did we miss?" the driver asked. "Negative," Werner said, confusion thick in his voice. "I saw the penetration. Then why isn't it burning?" The Sherman's turrets swung toward their position. Richter realized with cold clarity that they'd lost the initiative. The American tank was still combat effective, still dangerous, and now it knew exactly where they were. "Reverse, back to the secondary position." The Panzer's engine roared, tracks churned mud. They pulled back behind the hedgerow just as the Sherman's 75mm gun fired. The round screamed past, missing by meters, but it was close enough to make Richter's point. They were no longer fighting the same tank they'd been killing for weeks. Something had changed, and change in warfare usually favored whoever adapted first. Inside Donovan's Sherman, chaos had transformed into controlled urgency. The German round had punched through the right sponson armor exactly as designed. Metal fragments sprayed across the interior. Torres felt something hot slash across his shoulder. The driver, a Pennsylvanian kid named Kowalski, screamed a warning nobody needed. They all felt the impact, but they were still alive. The ammunition stored in the floor hadn't ignited. Steam hissed from ruptured water jackets, filling the fighting compartment with a scalding fog that made breathing difficult but not impossible. Donovan's training took over. He didn't think about why they hadn't exploded. He just reacted to the fact that they could still fight. "Gonna traverse right, barn at 2 o'clock. The turret whined as it rotated through the fog and gunsmoke. Donovan's gunner spotted the Panzer backing away from its position. The German crew had made a mistake. They'd assumed one hit meant one kill. They'd exposed themselves for that critical second too long, expecting an explosion that never came. "Target identified. Fire!" The 75mm gun bucked. The high explosive round struck the barn wall where the Panzer had been. Wood and stone exploded outward. By the time the smoke cleared, the German tank had vanished behind the hedgerow. But Donovan didn't care about the miss. What mattered was that his crew was breathing. His loader was already pulling another round from the floor storage, water dripping from the jacket housing. The ammunition was intact, accessible, safe. "Driver, reverse 50 yards and hull down behind that ridge." "Yes, sir." As the Sherman backed into cover, Donovan keyed his radio. "Bravo 2 to Bravo Actual. Contact with enemy armor. Tank took a penetrating hit to right sponson. No ammunition fire. Repeat, no ammo fire. We're still combat effective. The response came back immediately, disbelief evident even through the crackling static. Say again, Bravo 2. You took a penetrating hit? Affirmative. Wet stowage worked. The rounds didn't cook off. There was a pause. Then, copy that. All Bravo elements, did you hear that? Wet stowage tanks can take a hit. Engage accordingly. The message rippled through the American armored column like electricity through wire. Crews who'd been treating every engagement as potentially their last suddenly realized they might survive their mistakes. That single failed kill, that one Sherman that refused to burn, began shifting calculations across the entire tactical landscape. Richter pulled his Panzer into a covered position 300 meters back from the road. His crew sat in stunned silence, the kind that comes when fundamental assumptions get shattered by reality. Werner stared at his gun sight like it had betrayed him. I hit it, he said quietly. Perfect shot, right where it always works. I know, Richter replied. So why didn't it burn? That was the question, and Richter didn't have an answer. In 3 years of tank combat, he'd developed an instinctive understanding of how American armor died. One penetrating hit to the sponson meant fire, always fire. It was as reliable as gravity, but something had changed, something fundamental enough to invalidate months of tactical doctrine. Maybe we hit an empty rack, the driver suggested. Maybe they'd already expended their ammunition. Werner shook his head. They fired at us, the main gun. They still had rounds. Then maybe... We need to report this, Richter interrupted. Battalion needs to know the Shermans aren't burning like they used to. He reached for the radio handset, already composing the message in his head. But what would he say? That the Americans had somehow fixed their death trap tanks, that German tactics based on ammunition fires might no longer work. Command wouldn't want to hear it. They'd call it defeatist thinking, blame poor gunnery, insist that proper tactics would still prevail. But Richter had seen what he'd seen, and in war, ignoring evidence got people killed. The modification that saved Donovan's crew had been implemented with remarkable speed by American standards. When the Ordnance Department approved wet stowage in March of 1944, they set an aggressive production timeline. By June, 30% of new Shermans included the system. By August, that number reached 60%. By October, nearly every Sherman rolling off American assembly lines featured wet ammunition storage. The numbers told a story that German intelligence failed to recognize until far too late. In 1943, the US produced 17,726 Sherman tanks. In 1944, production hit 21,035 units. That meant roughly 12,000 wet stowage. Shermans reached European battlefields between June and December of 1944. 12,000 tanks that wouldn't burn the way German tactics expected them to. But production numbers alone didn't tell the full story. The real impact showed in survival statistics. Shermans with dry ammunition stowage, the old style, suffered ammunition fires in 60 to 80% of penetrating hits. Crew survival in those incidents remained catastrophically low, under 20%. Wet stowage, Shermans hit in the same locations, experienced ammunition fires in only 10 to 15% of cases. Crew survival rates in wet stowage tanks jumped to 60%. The water jackets didn't make Shermans invulnerable. They just gave crews a fighting chance to escape before their own ammunition killed them. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, but no less significant. American tank crews who'd been operating under a death sentence suddenly found themselves in vehicles that could take punishment and keep fighting. Morale improved. Tactics became more aggressive. Commanders who'd been hoarding armor to preserve strength started committing tanks more freely, knowing that a hit didn't automatically mean a total loss. Meanwhile, German tankers like Richter found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to die, according to plan. The easy kills disappeared. Engagements lasted longer. American tanks that should have been burning hulks kept shooting back, kept maneuvering, kept coordinating with infantry and artillery in ways that made killing them exponentially more difficult. By September of 1944, reports from across the Western Front confirmed what Richter had witnessed. American tanks were surviving hits that should have been fatal. German after-action reports began including phrases like "ammunition did not detonate" and "target remained operational despite penetration." Tank commanders who'd grown accustomed to single-shot kills found themselves expending multiple rounds to achieve the same result. The Germans tried to adapt. Gunners aimed for different weak points: the turret ring, the lower glacis plate, the track mechanisms. But these were smaller targets, harder to hit, especially in the close-range chaos of hedgerow fighting, and even when they scored penetrating hits, the Shermans weren't obliging them by exploding anymore. Oberst Heinrich Vogt commanded a panzer battalion in the 7th Army. By late September, his unit was down to 18 operational tanks from an authorized strength of 44. Losses weren't coming from combat alone. Mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, and fuel shortages had crippled German armor capabilities, but the combat losses bothered him most because they represented a fundamental shift in the tactical calculus. "The Americans have changed something," he told his staff during a briefing in a commandeered farmhouse east of Metz. "Their tanks aren't burning the way they did in Normandy. We're expending 2, sometimes 3 rounds per kill. Our ammunition can't sustain that rate of consumption." His intelligence officer, a captain who'd taught mathematics before the war, consulted a spreadsheet filled with depressing numbers. Current engagement reports show an average of 2.3 armor-piercing rounds per Sherman kill, up from 1.1 in July. If the trend continues... "It will continue," Vogt interrupted. "The Americans aren't going to unfix whatever they fixed, which means we need new tactics. Recommendations." The room fell silent. "What do you recommend when the enemy solves their biggest vulnerability? When the easy kills vanish and you're already outnumbered 5-1, when your tanks are running on fumes and theirs seem to have unlimited fuel?" Finally, his operations officer spoke. "We focus on mobility kills, track them, immobilize them, then finish them with follow-up shots. It takes more ammunition, but..." "We don't have more ammunition," Vogt said quietly. "We barely have enough for current operations. High Command can't ship us rounds that don't exist." That was the deeper crisis. German industry was collapsing. Allied bombing had devastated production facilities. Transportation networks were shredded. Even when ammunition existed, getting it to the front required miracles that happened less and less frequently. The Wehrmacht was running out of everything: shells, fuel, replacement vehicles, trained crews, time. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have bottomless reserves. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared. When ammunition ran low, fresh supplies arrived overnight. Fuel trucks rolled in daily. Replacement crews came forward already trained, already competent, already equipped with the latest modifications to their tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Donovan's Sherman, the one that survived the sponson hit, remained in service through August and into September. The crew named it Lucky Lady and painted a horseshoe on the turret. Torres's shoulder wound healed in 10 days. They patched the hole in the sponson with welded steel plate. The water jackets were replaced during a maintenance cycle. Within 2 weeks, they were back in action. But Donovan noticed something had changed in how his crew operated. They were still careful, still professional, but the paralyzing fear that had accompanied every mission in their old tank had diminished. They trusted the wet stowage. They'd seen it work. That trust translated into better performance under fire, clearer thinking in combat, willingness to take calculated risks that would have seemed suicidal in a dry stowage Sherman. Other crews reported similar experiences. Lieutenant James Brennan commanded a platoon in the 4th Armored Division. 3 of his 5 tanks had wet stowage. In an engagement near Nancy in mid-September, all 3 took hits. 2 suffered penetrations, neither burned. Both remained combat effective, long enough to suppress the German position and withdraw under smoke. Brennan's report climbed the chain of command with unusual speed. Battalion forwarded it to regiment. Regiment sent it to division. Division included it in their monthly after-action summary to 12th Army Group. By October, the data was undeniable. Wet stowage worked. It worked consistently. It worked well enough to fundamentally alter American armored doctrine. Tank destroyer battalions, which had been held in reserve to counter German armor, started getting reassigned to infantry support roles. The Shermans themselves could now survive long enough to deal with enemy tanks. Air-ground coordination improved because American armor could stay in the fight long enough for close air support to arrive. Artillery observers in Sherman tanks could remain forward even under anti-tank fire, calling in strikes that would have been impossible if every hit meant instant death. The Germans watched this evolution with growing alarm. What had been a technical advantage, the ability to destroy American tanks with single shots, was evaporating, and with it went the tactical edge that had allowed outnumbered German units to hold defensive positions against superior American forces. By November of 1944, the strategic situation in France had stabilized into a grinding advance toward Germany. The Americans pushed east. The Germans fell back. Armor clashed in a series of meeting engagements that favored whoever could maintain higher operational readiness. And increasingly, that meant the Americans. Richter's battalion retreated through Lorraine in early November. They'd started the campaign with 42 tanks. They were down to 9. Only 3 were Panzer Mark IVs. The rest were captured French equipment and obsolete Mark IIIs that couldn't penetrate a Sherman frontally, even at point-blank range. Ammunition was rationed to 5 rounds per gun per day. Fuel allocations meant they could only move at night. "We're not fighting a war anymore," Werner said one evening as they waited in a forest hide position. "We're just dying slowly." Richter didn't disagree. He'd stopped believing in victory sometime around August. Now he fought for smaller reasons, keeping his crew alive, delaying the American advance by hours instead of days, maintaining some shred of professional competence in the face of inevitable defeat. "The Shermans," Werner continued, "they don't burn anymore. You notice that?" "I noticed. Why do you think that is?" Richter shrugged. "The Americans fixed whatever was broken. That's what they do. They solve problems. We should try it sometime." It was a dangerous thing to say, the kind of comment that could get you reported for defeatism if the wrong person heard it. But Werner just laughed, a sound without humor. "Yeah, maybe in the next war." The next war. The phrase hung in the cold air like a prophecy, because this war was clearly ending, and not in Germany's favor. The only question was how many more men would die before the inevitable conclusion arrived. December brought snow and the last major German offensive of the war in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler committed his final armored reserves to a desperate thrust through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. For 2 weeks, the offensive achieved surprising success against surprised and outnumbered American units. But even in the Bulge, where German armor enjoyed temporary numerical superiority, the wet stowage Shermans proved their worth. The 101st Airborne, surrounded at Bastogne, held out partly because the handful of Sherman tanks supporting them refused to burn. When hit, they took damage, lost mobility, suffered casualties, but they didn't erupt into funeral pyres that destroyed morale along with machines. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, they did it with armored columns that included over 200 Sherman tanks, almost all with wet stowage. The Germans threw everything they had left at those columns: Panthers, Tigers, 88mm guns, Panzerfausts, mines, desperation. They killed Shermans. They killed a lot of Shermans, but the kills came harder, cost more, and didn't stop the American advance. Richter's Panzer was destroyed on December 23, 1944, not by enemy fire, but by mechanical failure. The transmission gave out during a withdrawal north of Bastogne. They had no spare parts, no recovery vehicle, no time. They set demolition charges, salvaged what weapons they could carry, and joined the infantry retreat on foot. Werner kept his personal logbook, the one with tally marks for Sherman kills. In the final entry, written in cramped handwriting by flashlight, he noted, 17 kills, confirmed, July through September, 4 kills October through December. The Americans learned, we didn't. The final accounting came in the spring of 1945, when American armored divisions rolled across Germany with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. By then, wet stowage had become standard in 95% of operational Shermans. The modification that had begun as an engineering solution to a tactical problem had evolved into something more significant, proof that American industrial adaptability could overcome initial design failures faster than the enemy could exploit them. The statistics told a story that German tank commanders had learned through bitter experience. Between June and December of 1944, the U.S. Army lost approximately 4,300 Sherman tanks in combat on the Western Front. Of those, roughly 2,800 were dry stowage models. The remaining 1,500 were wet stowage variants. Given that wet stowage tanks outnumbered dry stowage tanks by nearly 2 to 1 during that period, the loss rates told a clear story. Dry stowage. Shermans died at nearly double the rate of their improved counterparts, and when they died, their crews died with them. Wet stowage didn't make Shermans invulnerable. It didn't solve the fundamental problem of facing German tanks with superior guns and heavier armor. But it gave American crews something they desperately needed: survivability, the chance to learn from mistakes, the ability to bail out and fight again in another tank. That ability to reconstitute crews, to preserve experienced tankers who could train replacements, created a compounding advantage. By early 1945, the average American tank commander had 6 months of combat experience. His German counterpart, if he'd survived that long, was often fighting with a crew of teenagers who'd received 4 weeks of training before being thrown into combat. The technological gap that had favored Germany in 1940 through 1942 had reversed, not because American tanks suddenly became superior. The Panther and Tiger still outgunned the Sherman in direct combat, but because American industry could identify problems, develop solutions, and implement them across thousands of vehicles faster than the German forces could adapt their tactics. Oberst Vogt survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in Bavaria on May 5, 1945, 3 days before the official capitulation. In post-war interviews conducted by U.S. Army historians, he spoke candidly about the evolution of armored combat on the Western Front. "We believed the Sherman was a death trap," he said in one session recorded in July of 1945. And for a time it was. We could kill them easily, too easily. It made us overconfident. When they stopped burning, when our single-shot kills became 2-shot or 3-shot engagements, we didn't adjust fast enough. We couldn't adjust. We lacked the industrial capacity to produce enough ammunition for the new reality. We lacked the fuel to maneuver properly. We lacked everything except excuses. The interviewer asked if he thought the wet stowage modification had been the decisive factor in American armored superiority. Vogt considered the question carefully before answering. "No single modification wins wars," he said finally. "But the fact that the Americans could identify a problem, engineer a solution, and deploy it across their entire tank fleet in 6 months, that told us something more important than whether individual tanks burned or didn't burn. It told us we were fighting an enemy who could outproduce us, outsupply us, and outadapt us simultaneously. That realization was more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat." Sergeant Donovan rotated home in March of 1945. He'd survived 11 months of combat across France, Luxembourg, and into Germany. He'd commanded 3 different Shermans. The first 2 had been dry stowage models. He'd lost both to ammunition fires and barely escaped with his life each time. The third lucky lady was a wet stowage variant. It took 4 penetrating hits during its service life. None resulted in ammunition fires. None killed the crew. When Donovan stepped off the transport ship in New York Harbor, a reporter from Stars and Stripes asked him about his experience. The interview was brief, just a few questions for a human interest piece about returning veterans. But one exchange made it into the published article. What was the biggest difference between the Sherman you started with and the one you finished with? Donovan thought about it, remembering the screams of men burning alive in dry stowage tanks, remembering the steam hissing from ruptured water jackets that had saved his life. The new ones let you live long enough to learn how to fight, he said. That's all you can ask from a tank, not that it's invincible, just that it gives you a chance. The reporter scribbled the quote, thanked him, and moved on to interview a pilot. The article ran 2 days later with a headline about heroes returning home. Donovan's quote appeared in the third paragraph, 7 lines of text that summarized a transformation in armored warfare that had killed thousands and saved thousands more. Klaus Richter ended the war on foot, retreating through Bavaria with what remained of his unit. He'd been a tanker for 4 years. He'd fought in Africa, France, and Germany. He'd destroyed 17 Allied tanks, most of them Shermans. But by April of 1945, he was just another German soldier trying to survive long enough to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. He was captured on April 28th by elements of the U.S. 7th Army. The processing went quickly. Name, rank, unit, search for weapons, assignment to a POW holding area in a converted factory outside Munich. As he stood in line with hundreds of other prisoners, an American Sherman rolled past. The tank commander, a young lieutenant, sat in the open hatch eating an apple. He didn't even glance at the prisoners. Richter studied the Sherman as it passed. He could see the modifications even from a distance, the newer welding patterns on the hull, the subtle differences in how the sponson armor was configured. This was almost certainly a wet stowage model, though from the outside you couldn't tell for certain. Werner, standing beside him in the POW line, followed his gaze. Remember when we used to kill those in one shot? I remember. Seems like a long time ago. It was a different war, Richter said quietly. We just didn't realize it. The Sherman disappeared around a corner. Its engine noise faded into the general chaos of occupied Germany. Trucks hauling supplies, jeeps ferrying officers, the distant thump of artillery that still echoed from pockets where German units hadn't gotten word of the surrender, or had gotten word and were fighting anyway, for reasons that no longer made sense to anyone. The modification that had started as a technical fix had rippled through the war in ways engineers in Detroit never anticipated. It changed tactics, it changed morale, it changed the calculus of armored combat in a theater where numerical superiority already favored the Allies, but where technical vulnerabilities had partially offset that advantage. Between June of 1944 and May of 1945, wet stowage Shermans participated in every major American armored operation on the Western Front. They fought through Normandy, liberated Paris, punched through the Siegfried Line, held during the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, and drove deep into the heart of Germany. The tanks themselves remained mechanically similar to earlier variants. Same engine, same transmission, same suspension, same gun, at least until the arrival of the 76mm armed variants in late 1944. But that one modification, those water-filled jackets surrounding ammunition storage, changed what it meant to crew a Sherman. It transformed the experience from near-suicidal to merely dangerous. And in war, that difference, measured in lives saved, missions accomplished, and psychological resilience maintained under conditions that would break lesser men. The U.S. Army published its final assessment of Sherman survivability in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. The report ran to 347 pages of data, analysis, and recommendations for future tank design. The section on ammunition stowage occupied 42 pages and included detailed statistics that confirmed what tankers like Donovan had learned through experience. Wet stowage reduced ammunition fire probability from 72% to 12% in tanks suffering penetrating hits. Crew survival rates increased from 18% to 63%. The modification added approximately 400 pounds to the tank's weight and cost an additional $350 per vehicle to implement. Across 12,000 tanks, that meant an investment of $4.2 million. The report calculated that wet stowage had saved approximately 3,200 American tankers' lives during the final year of the war in Europe. It had kept roughly 1,800 Shermans in service that would otherwise have been destroyed by ammunition fires, and it had demonstrated a principle that would influence American military procurement for decades, that adaptability and rapid improvement of existing systems could sometimes matter more than waiting for perfect next-generation designs. The German perspective on wet stowage emerged gradually through post-war interrogations and captured documents. What became clear was that German intelligence had identified the modification by August of 1944, but had failed to communicate its significance effectively through the command chain. Lower-level tank commanders like Richter knew the Shermans had changed, but higher headquarters, focused on strategic concerns and increasingly detached from battlefield reality, never fully grasped how a simple modification was undermining their tactical doctrine. A captured German tactical manual from October of 1944 still recommended aiming for Sherman ammunition stowage areas as the primary kill method. The manual hadn't been updated to reflect the new reality because the bureaucracy necessary to update field manuals had collapsed under the weight of Germany's industrial and administrative decline. So, German tankers continued using tactics optimized for an enemy that no longer existed, while the Americans they fought had evolved past the vulnerabilities those tactics exploited. In the broader context of World War II, wet stowage was a footnote. It didn't win battles the way air superiority did. It didn't shape campaigns the way logistics determined outcomes. It was simply one modification among thousands that collectively gave the Allies an edge in the grinding arithmetic of industrial warfare. But for the men inside those tanks, it was everything. It was the difference between burning alive and walking away, between dying on your first mission and surviving long enough to go home, between being a statistic in a loss report and being a name on a roster of returnees. Donovan kept in touch with several men from his various crews over the years. They'd gather occasionally at VFW halls, drink beer, and talk about everything except the war. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the crowd thinned, someone would bring up the old Shermans, the dry stowage models they'd lost, the friends who hadn't made it out, and then someone else would mention Lucky Lady, or whatever they'd named their wet stowage tank, how it had taken a hit and didn't burn, how they'd climbed out through the hatches while steam hissed from the water jackets, how they'd lived to fight another day in a war where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Those conversations never lasted long. Veterans didn't like dwelling on narrow escapes. It felt too much like tempting fate retroactively. But the recognition was always there, unspoken but understood. They'd been lucky to serve when they did after the modification reached the front, lucky to have engineers back home who'd identified the problem and fixed it, lucky to be alive. Richter never had those reunions. German veterans of the Panzerwaffe kept their experiences to themselves, buried under layers of national shame and personal trauma. He returned to his home in Dusseldorf, found it reduced to rubble, and started over in a country that no longer existed in the form he'd defended. He worked construction, married, had children, and died in 1978 without ever speaking publicly about his wartime service. His son found the old logbook while cleaning out the family home after the funeral. The tally marks for destroyed tanks, the dates, the brief entries about combat actions that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. And on the last page, that final notation. The Americans learned. We didn't. The son donated the logbook to a local museum. It sat in their archives for years before a researcher stumbled across it while working on a book about tank combat in Normandy. The researcher recognized its significance, not for the kills Richter had recorded, but for that final assessment. A German tanker acknowledging that his enemy had adapted faster than he could respond. The Sherman's evolution from death trap to survivable combat vehicle wasn't unique. The Americans modified everything constantly. Aircraft, weapons, tactics, even basic equipment like boots and helmets. What made the wet stowage modification significant was its impact on the men who depended on it. It represented the difference between a military that treated soldiers as expendable resources and one that invested in keeping them alive. Germany had built better tanks. The Panther was superior to the Sherman in almost every technical specification. The Tiger was a masterpiece of armored engineering, but Germany couldn't build enough of them, couldn't supply them adequately, and couldn't replace crews fast enough when those magnificent machines were destroyed. The Americans built good enough tanks in overwhelming numbers and then made them better while the war was still being fought. That approach, the willingness to accept imperfect solutions and improve them iteratively, characterized American industrial warfare. It frustrated German officers who valued perfection and comprehensive planning, but it won battles, campaigns, and ultimately the war. By May of 1945, when the fighting finally stopped, approximately 14,000 wet stowage Shermans were in service with American and Allied forces. They'd fought from Normandy to Bavaria, from the Ardennes to Austria. They'd faced everything the Wehrmacht could throw at them: Panthers, Tigers, 88s, Panzerfausts, mines, artillery, and desperate courage born of defending doomed positions. They'd lost thousands of tanks, but they'd saved thousands of crews, and those crews had gone on to train new tankers, share hard-won tactical knowledge, and push the advance forward with the confidence that came from knowing their equipment gave them a fighting chance. The German tankers who survived learned to respect the Shermans, even if they never feared them the way they feared Soviet T-34s or British Fireflies. The Americans, they said, fought with crude efficiency. They didn't have the elegance of German tactical doctrine or the mechanical superiority of German engineering, but they showed up in overwhelming numbers with equipment that worked, soldiers who were well-fed and adequately trained, and a supply system that seemed capable of conjuring ammunition and fuel from thin air. And their tanks, those mediocre Shermans that German propaganda had mocked as inferior, stopped burning long enough to win the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.